screen from.
Yeah, I am actually also recording, and so I won't forget. I've just now started to record the session in the cloud so that we can share this with some other people that could not make it.
So that was helpful, Chris. I made it work. It was the sliding I needed to do.
Excellent. It took me a while too. Yeah.
Well, if you go to full screen, you can pop out the speaker panel and then expand it and still have the slides. If I'm running on two screens, so I can like go full screen on one monitor, and then I've got all of the gallery stuff, the Brady Bunch, on another screen.
Yeah.
That's a good trick.
I actually said that like it's like 2 years ago when we started doing this. I don't know. And I made a reference to the Brady Bunch. Like I must be the oldest person at work. Tumbleweed.
I think you have that problem here, Rob.
We all know
Probably
the
get started.
Brady Bunch.
We'll get started a couple minutes past the hour.
And next week I can come back with some feedback, because I'll certainly ask the question. Okay.
Sounds good.
On both the classification and the ability to approve this year versus next year. I just don't know. Especially
You could excuse me, if you're not on mute. If you're not on mute, if you could mute if you're not a presenter.
And you know, you have the power, Dan. You can mute them.
Yeah. Seems a little mean-spirited.
I like that you have the power.
Another oblique reference to
Yes.
right, old stuff.
Well, look there, we've got 35 people. That's wonderful.
Yeah, it is.
Did you guys see the post in SIKM recently about knowledge sharing?
Which one? The number of knowledge managers?
No, this one was about best practices.
Oh yeah.
And
That was I think that was Jasper also.
that was.
Mm-hmm.
It seems like it's a related topic.
Okay, I'm going to go ahead and kick us off today. I want to, first of all, thank everybody for joining us, our observers in this fishbowl methodology, as well as our presenters, the fish inside of the fishbowl. You know, this is something, by the way, my name is Daniel Rant. I'm based here in Guatemala. Been doing knowledge management related work for a number of years. And I had a discussion, I think it was just going back and forth in email, because Stan Garfield is going to be leading a panel discussion and next week at the at KM World. And I had mentioned to him that, hey, Stan, we could do this as a fishbowl. And he said, well, Dan, that's a great idea, but why don't we do it for some of the questions? And I appreciate everybody's responses and going back and forth as we took a look at 3 recent discussions that in SIKM that were very interesting and had a lot of activity. And we used a little bit of crowdsourcing to vote. And then I just asked people to volunteer. And we ended up coming up with 6 fish presenters today. This methodology, I've been working for the last 7 months. It's been a lot of fun in supporting one of the agencies of the United Nations, which is the International Organization for Migration. And one of the things that we're doing is we are discovering tacit knowledge, different best practices and knowledge products that are going on throughout our 25 country region, Mexico, Central America, and the Caribbean. And we're using these thematic sessions, and our favorite methodology when we do that are these fishbowls. Now, I had never done a fishbowl actually myself before this, and it's worked out really well for us. And I wasn't familiar with it or anything. So if anybody wants any other information on the methodology itself, there's a lot of information, of course, available on the internet, but just reach out to me. I'd be glad to share that with you. So today I want to, well, first of all, I want to thank Stan. Thanks, Stan, again, for coming up with this idea. We appreciate it. And who knows if this works out really well as a way to take a deeper dive into some very interesting across the board issues that a lot of us would be able to learn from. We may be able to make this a periodic type event. So today, I want to first allow, starting with Robert Taylor, some quick introductions from our presenters. And again, thank you for courageously volunteering to be our presenters today. Robert, quick introduction.
Hey, thank you, Daniel, and welcome everyone. So I'm Robert Taylor. I'm in London, England. I'm a long-term knowledge managementist as a consultant and functional lead. I'm presently knowledge manager for Systemic, which is a well-established startup think and do tank focused on the UN Sustainable Development Goals. Thank you.
Thank you, Robert. And next up, Andrew Muris. Andrew?
Hey, you pronounced that well. Thank you. Good morning, Andrew Muris. I office out of the Dallas-Fort Worth area in Texas. Work for a large defense and aerospace company called BAE Systems. Some of you may have known it in the past as British Aerospace. I work several of our knowledge activities primarily associated with knowledge transfer and our lessons learned activities. And I look forward to sharing how we measure some of those going forward.
Well, thank you very much, Andrew. And Martin Cleaver. Martin? Uh-oh. He may be swimming. Martin, are you there?
Hey, Dan,
Hello? Yeah.
can you ask Japeth Mooley to mute your line, please?
Yeah, can we have everybody that's not a presenter right now, please mute. Chris Collison, go ahead and introduce yourself. Thank you.
Thanks, Dan. I'm Chris Collison. I've been doing knowledge management since the last millennium sometime. So
Or do we need to wait for that one?
We're getting a lot of
Again.
people. Juiced Adrian, Juiced Mohammed.
Again, if we could, I'd like to ask everybody to mute if you're not on. I know what Stan's thinking. He's thinking, that's why we don't do Zoom online meetings for our SIKM calls. Sorry, Stan. But if everybody could just mute. And Chris, could you say that one more time? Because I wasn't able to hear you.
that's nice. I get two goes. Yeah, I'm Chris Collison. I'm a consultant in knowledge management, like many of us here. Been doing it since 1995 corporately, and the last 16 years independently, and based in the UK.
Well, thanks for being with us. Tom Short.
Hi, good morning, good afternoon, everyone. My name is Tom Short. I'm based in San Francisco, California, originally from Wisconsin and other parts of the Midwest. I've been in knowledge management as a consultant from around 1996 on. I've worked for a number of very large firms that work on global client projects around the world. And Dan and I were colleagues way back in IBM days. So we go back a fair ways.
Exactly. Spent some time in Wisconsin together. That was a lot of fun. And finally, Nancy Dixon. Nancy?
Good morning. I'm in Austin, Texas. Andrew would know that's just a couple hundred miles south of Dallas. And I've been both teaching about knowledge management and consulting in knowledge management. I consult primarily with nonprofits and largely with people in developing countries, helping them share their knowledge from region to region and so forth. But taught for a long time at the George Washington University in Washington, D.C. and was teaching knowledge there as well.
Well, thanks again, Nancy, for joining us. And let me give one more chance for Martin Cleaver. Martin, were you able to join us this morning? Okay. Next up, what I want to do to set some context is I've got one more slide. So no death by PowerPoint today at all. And I want to introduce Jasper Levertu, who, as I said earlier when we were just getting on, had the courage. You know, it takes a lot of courage sometimes to ask a question like this. And Jasper is in the Netherlands, and he asked this question originally about how to measure knowledge sharing and the value, et cetera. Jasper, can you give us a little bit more, first, welcome. And can you give us a little bit more context on your question, what it was all about, and what some of the replies may have led you to do in terms of taking action and thinking differently about this topic? That was a great setup that I just made. I hope Jasper's on. He said he's going to be on for the first 30 minutes today. Jasper, maybe you're on mute. Well, I can speak actually. Yeah, Jasper.
I don't see him on the attendee list.
Oh, okay. He just sent me a note that said he was only going to be on for the first 30 minutes, so maybe something happened. But in any case, measuring successful knowledge sharing. Let me tell you that this is and many of you would agree, it's a conundrum wherever you may come from, as a consulting background, as a knowledge manager, working as part of a knowledge sharing team, kind of internally as an advisor in this area. You know, there's a lot of there's pressure that always comes from different areas, maybe around budget time, for example. What were our results for the last period of time, or whatever it might have been? So we're always asked to measure, and it's always not that difficult. It can very often be quite difficult when it comes to measuring, because it's that tangibility may not be there for us. So this is our topic today. And the way that this works is we're going to have our 5 presenters, our fish inside of the fishbowl, start the discussion, and they're going to ping pong around some ideas on this very interesting topic. And I'm also going to ask observers that either by raising your hand or participating in the chat to ask questions. So I'm going to go ahead and get started. And I've asked, by the way, just so you know ahead of time, because we want to have quite a collection of different thoughts and ideas, and that, like I like to call, collective elaboration happening during the session. I've asked that the main presenters spend only about a minute for any time they're talking and any ideas and stories they may be sharing. And I want to get started with Nancy. Nancy, do you want to kick us off today? Measuring successful knowledge sharing. How can we do this?
Well, for me, the first step is deciding what you mean by that. And so there's a lot of ways to think about measuring. You know, what's the purpose that we're measuring for? Are you trying to improve the outcome, or are you trying to show ROI for the management? Are you trying to say whether or not knowledge sharing occurred, or are you trying to find out the results of knowledge sharing? So what you're after here depends a lot on how you go about measuring. And the third piece of it is the unit of measure. Are you talking about learning within teams? Are you talking about sharing learning across the whole organization? But first we have to get clear on what we're trying to do, and then I think you can find ways to do it.
Yeah. Okay. Nice. Tom, do you want to build on that?
Well, I'm a huge proponent of metrics and measurement, especially when it comes to identifying where value will be realized in any effort we do, whether it's knowledge management or process redesign or community, anything to do with the consulting work with clients. We need to measure in order to legitimize the work we've done. That said, there are other kinds of rationale that companies use to do work. Take, for instance, annual strategic planning or annual budgeting. No one asks the company to, at a board meeting, so what was the ROI on last year's annual strategic planning effort? And so at the end of the day, I think we also have to disentangle what the table stakes are, which, these are just required things you got to do to be in the game, versus what are discretionary activities, and therefore are we getting the most value from them that we could for the resource we're devoting.
Absolutely. And I'm just going to ask the fish to jump in because I don't want to, call on you, but so Robert, I'll start with you though. I will call on you. Robert, want to build on that and then we'll continue to pass the baton.
Yeah, I was exactly the same as Nancy. Like, it's a question we've all looked at 100 times, and I thought, look at it afresh. And I was exactly like you, Nancy. I was analytic about every word, and that always liberates new thoughts because you can see all the different, aspects to it. And so I thought that just by focusing on it, I got a lot out of it. And I can also relate to what Tom said, because I think sometimes in our whole field of knowledge management, we are asked to kind of justify ourselves, and like so many other things really aren't. Now, look, honestly, I'm cool about measurement, except that one thing we ought to have really learned, I think, through this COVID time, if we didn't know before, is just how hard measurement systems are. And once again, as Nancy said, it's all about definitions. How many jabs have gone in how many arms? Sounds like a simple question. Turns out it's really full of muddle.
Yeah. Chris, I see your hand up.
Yeah, I'm with you, Rob. I've gone back to the words as well, and I was reflecting earlier today on what do we mean by the act of sharing. We just throw that word around, but if I wanted to share a chocolate cake that I've got with you, then there are a number of ways I can do it. One way is not to maybe leave it in a tin in the third drawer down and assume that you're going to find it, and that's the world of SharePoint. But in reality, I would make you aware of it. I'd check that you're not gluten intolerant. I'd probably come and give it to you and say, Rob, this is a lovely bit of cake. Please have this. It'll do you good, or at least you'll enjoy it, maybe. And there's a whole spectrum of our personal investment in how we share knowledge, which takes me finally to a quote that Peter Senge made, which I think is powerful. He says, sharing knowledge is not about giving people something or getting something from them. That's only valid for information sharing. Sharing knowledge occurs when people are genuinely interested in helping one another develop new capacities for action. It's about creating learning process. So there's more investment, I think, in a relationship and sharing to happen.
New capacities for action. Really nice. Andrew?
So working at a defense and aerospace company, an engineering company, people love analytics. A couple of people have mentioned, what's the purpose in getting to some sort of analytics? And so we always have to think about it from that perspective. Even to our CEO, he wants to see numbers, data. And so we typically have to do something around what's reasonable, a reasonable person theory, you might say in some of this. I go back to, if you don't measure anything at all, you go back to the idea that, well, people say that they're doing knowledge sharing, knowledge transfer, these types of things, but are they really? Can we actually see that they're doing something? And so just some sort of movement, some sort of motion, some sort of tracking of something is at least a beginning or something that we start with. Now we do get to actual getting down to real numbers, and we go through finance and we get to real data and ROI and business value. And I'll be actually presenting that to some of our year-end metrics to our CEO next week. So we have to show some data, and as long as it's reasonable person theory, we can typically get through it.
Yeah. Over the last 8 months, I'm going to call it a labor of love. I've been designing this course for the master's degree program in knowledge management at Kent State. It's called Designing and Implementing KM in the Workplace. And I'm really proud of the course because I've tried to put it together from the trenches and really teach real tangible things. But I had something happen to me this week related because we were going over a segment in the class, and one of the students segment on measuring knowledge sharing, et cetera. And one of the students, because I mentioned, storytelling can be a great way. And the student said to me, and this is via we have a Slack channel set up to go back and forth, and said, storytelling sounds so much like the 2000s. It made me feel kind of dinosaurish, but which may be the case. But I always thought that storytelling was a great way because other people could hear that story and say, oh, that's what we expect in terms of collaborative behavior. I can do that too. But I don't know, maybe I'm off track or whatever it might be. And so comment from our fish.
Yeah, let me build on that a little bit. I think the value of one of the values storytelling brings is that it provides the context for whatever you did. And if you just say, okay, here's what we did without the context, it's really hard for people to do something similar or to know how they need to change it. Although that doesn't seem to me, I think I think storytelling, if it's connected to something like the process, the most significant change process, which is an evaluation process, it works. But just storytelling itself, I don't think is a way to measure.
Yeah.
I think the thing that you've got to be careful about with measurement is it's important to realize there are two flavors of metrics or measurements. You got your in-process and your outcome metrics. And so your in-process metrics are, we collected 550 lessons learned. Okay, that and $1.25 will get you on the subway. Whereas the outcome metric is, and we documented 300 examples of reuse that saved 14 lives and $3 million of equipment and material. So I think it's important to be clear about measuring for the sake of measuring also isn't necessarily going to get you where you want to go. And I think the stories are a great way to anecdotally demonstrate value. And sometimes in some cases where the thing you're doing can't really be quantified readily or translated into ROI, then the story becomes a really important way of describing the value and propagating, promoting that activity further.
Yeah, nice. Chris?
Yeah, it takes me right back, Tom, to way back in the early days in BP when we did some work as a KM team with the mergers and acquisitions team and tried to get, as we had been doing during our pilots, the senior person in each pilot to say something to camera about the value of the work that we've done. And most of them would do it. And you could add up the numbers and an accountant would argue with them, but there were enough credible people saying this made a difference that it was valuable collateral. But the guy from M&A, he said, I won't do it. He said, for me, knowledge management is in there with the spaghetti, but I'm not prepared to say this is the unique contribution that only KM has made. And I think that's the battle we will always find ourselves fighting in KM. There's too many other things that are rightfully integrated with the work that we're doing to try and get a single measurable result out of it.
Yeah, Andrew?
And I'll build a little bit on this storytelling, but maybe from a more negative impact is that we have a difficult time actually coming up with good stories and real stories that make a difference. Again, when we're in an analytical type organization, yeah, they like stories sometimes, but collecting them, getting people to actually discuss them and identify, was there a real impact associated with this, or how do we measure some of that impact even from that story? We have a difficult time collecting and then even showing it out or propagating it out to the rest of our society. So I'm interested in, or to the rest of our company. So I'm interested in, maybe how others have looked at collecting those stories pretty well, because we find it difficult.
Yeah, it's interesting. Robert?
Yeah, I think Tom completely nailed it there with your in-process and outcome measures. And this question of measurement of KM often confuses the two, and people want to measure, the stuff going on. But to Andrew's point, hi Andrew, we met once while I was at VA Systems. To Andrew's point, yeah, you want to see some activity as well, which is your in-process, isn't it? So you've got to measure that. You remind me of a nice BA Systems story, which was we had the project manager of Astute, which is a nuclear powered subs, I should say, they're not nuclear armed subs, come and see us. It was actually fascinating, but he actually said there on the stage in front of people, because of lessons learned, we saved 9 months off the build of the second boat. So there's pretty big bucks, but that's exactly the point. Getting clear in your mind, the outcome is not going to be a knowledge thing, is it? It's going to be a business thing. The input was a knowledge activity, and as Chris said, I'm going to keep the spaghetti phrase.
Wow. Yeah, we're getting a lot of fascinating comments and good questions as well in the chat, and I'm going to make sure that we capture all those along with this recording and share it back. And Andrew Trickett, by the way, I saw as an observer, you had your hand up earlier, so please, I will call on you if you put your hand up. And Nancy, do I see your hand up right now?
Yeah, I just wanted to say that one of the best examples we have of storytelling, I think, comes from Fleur. If you remember Fleur, when John was there at the head of that program, and he had a November, K-N-O-W, November, and all of the communities, at which there were probably 20 there, would send in stories. And then the clever thing he did was he would kind of winnow them down to maybe 15 really good stories that came in. And most of those stories had an amount of savings connected to them. And then he would ask the executive team to choose the winner, which meant the executive team had to read every one of those stories before they could choose who won it. So it was a really clever thing. And then there was a big trophy that went to the community that did the best. But that idea that he involved the executive teams, which is also what happens with the process called the most significant change, which is a storytelling evaluation system. They use the top management to choose the most useful stories or the most helpful stories.
Yeah, John's program under his leadership was more than famous. I might refer to it as legendary. I see John is with us today. John, did you want to make a quick comment, given Nancy's applaudatory words?
Sure. Yeah, and hello to everyone that I haven't seen in a long time. Yeah. Thank you, Nancy. And I think this goes very closely to what Tom said about the board asking about strategic plans or other things. If you can get the executive team to believe in what you're doing, then you have much less of a hard time presenting the value. And actually, one of the things we would do in the November campaign is not only share the stories, but then we'd say, and if you think these are good, here's our statistics. So then we could say, look, there were, 50,000 questions that happened that were like this. And so you were able to instill in the executive organization the broad expanse of knowledge sharing and collaboration by using a handful of stories and the volume of statistics behind it.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, go ahead, Tom.
I'm musing on Jasper's original post where there's a subtle shift in the conversation we're having away from maybe what he was asking about. He was asking about these meetings of the technical community that they have where they're in person, people fly in and they get together and talk for a few days. And he was asking, he recognized the fact that part of the value of doing that is the just getting together part and meeting each other for the first time face to face. And we've all in knowledge management for years have heard this, over and over again. Like the value of offsites isn't whatever they present on the main stage. It's the beer afterwards at the bar or the dinner out. That's the value. It's because we're making these connections. And Jasper's question, as I read it, was, how do we measure the value of doing that, right? Because it costs a lot of money. I mean, when I was with PwC, we had 200,000 employees around the world, and we had, I don't remember how many hundred only in the knowledge management community. But they spent a lot of money, like taking over Orlando, Florida, and bringing people in from all over the country for in-person 1-week meetings of whole practices. And, it was a huge budget item. Why did they do that? Like, how'd they justify that? They knew it was maybe one part the breakout sessions on technical topics for the latest tax and accounting things. But they also knew there's a tremendous value that comes from having these practice people meet each other face to face and establish connections that then allow them to go back out into the field, back out into their respective home offices in different cities, and have a contact who represents a pool of expertise or experience with a particular area that they can pick up the phone and just call, hey, good to, that was great seeing you. And we know how this goes, right? And so Jasper's question was an interesting one around that particular thing. Like, how do you measure that? We used to call it social capital, but I don't know if that's an area that others have an idea about. But I mean, I think it was a very interesting question he posed.
That is an interesting question. We think that, as we begin to come perhaps optimistically thinking out of the global pandemic, maybe there's going to be more opportunity for people to get together face to face. And wouldn't it be nice to have a really nice way to be able to kind of justify that from the sharing? I mean, you hear a lot of CEOs, a lot of leaders of companies talking about how much they may be losing today because the fact that people aren't getting together and collaborating in different areas where, different companies, this is industry agnostic really. So it's an interesting thought. Yeah, we have a question. Let me just go off the board a little bit. Ryan Fitzgerald. Ryan, go ahead and contribute if you don't mind showing your video as you do so.
Sure. Sorry, my camera's not working at the moment.
Oh, no problem. I have a radio face also. Don't worry about it.
I said no once, and now it's not letting me. Just on the comment about capturing the value in these meetings of connections. One experience I've had was with Deloitte at a partners meeting in Banff. Actually, Northern Toronto sorry, not Banff, but Northern Toronto at a ski resort, was the addition of these sort of smart tags that went around the practitioner's necks. And they were basically data analytics being monitored on who was talking to who. And they were able to present data during the conference to show the social network happening. They didn't reveal names, but they had the names. But basically, they would know who's talking to who and where they were in the conference center. So it was like GPS, but indoors. And it was a really interesting dynamic to see the dots flow into different things. So they were tracking event participation, places where they would set up little booths for discovery and stuff. And they could see the traffic going to which ones and who went there. And then they could map it to where their business groupings were, to say, well, look at all the M&A folks went over here, and so on. So it was a very high-tech, interesting way to look at that data, but then you could take that data and present it back sort of as the value statement to the crowd.
Yeah, that's a really interesting, Tom mentioned that he and I 20 years ago were at IBM together, and it's kind of an extemporaneous social network or organizational network analysis you're talking about. And we actually had some examples of those smart tags 20 years ago that were put in play by what was known at the time as the Institute for Knowledge Management. And it was really cool, but the technology at the time, I don't know if it was ready for prime time, and that may be more ready today. Robert, I see you have a comment.
It's funny. Ryan, you must have astrally thought projected to me, or I did to you, because my story was my early days in Deloitte, or Touche as it was in London then, and we'd all go away just after Christmas. We were still only about 500 of us, so it was a long time ago. And some miserable person must have questioned the partners about why did they go to such expense and have an open bar and everything. And they said, we always see a spike in business afterwards. And it makes perfect sense to me, because people who didn't know would say, oh, hey, Robert, what's this knowledge thing that you do? Come and have a drink. Perhaps I could introduce you to my client. It makes perfect sense to me, which those conversations, just would not have happened. And it's great that Tom took us back to the question, because the question was kind of more about that. I don't know whether we call that knowledge sharing or just say it's, relationship capital. One of the things that really attracted me about Systemic, where I am now, was, it's an amazingly well-connected organization. I mean, it's access to people. And I've also seen something like what Ryan mentioned recently with mapping. There's huge numbers of players in the sort of sustainability world. The mapping of connections is like really revealing, and it's kind of the first time I've really felt the reality of that term. We probably learned from Leif Edmondson about relationship capital.
Yeah, Andrew.
Yes, and I appreciate, Rob, that you mentioned about that one Deloitte story in London. Considering our headquarters is in London, I thought that was an interesting story I'd read before, I think on SIKM or one of the other places. But I wanted to also comment, I think Andrew Trickett put something just now in chat about, the innovation and connections associated with remote work. And we actually are starting to find some of that. So for example, we run fairly large sessions on how do we apply lessons from many of our big programs. We're now able to run some of these globally that we weren't able to do before. So, we couldn't really get all these people globally together now. And just running one earlier this week. We had some discussion with someone in the UK and someone in the US saying, hey, now that this other country is looking at purchasing this type of equipment, should we get back and consider looking to that country? And they said, yeah, hey, maybe that's something that we need to consider doing. And so they started making a connection at that point that we never would have done, you might say, even in person, but it's some knowledge sharing that's happening remotely that would not have happened in the past. So there's some good and bad. There's really good parts about meeting in person, and then there's some good parts about being able to share things, in our remote status that we're currently in too.
Nice. Nancy.
I think one of the ways to do that is to take advantage of the staff surveys that all companies seem to do. And I know at one point IBM looked at the difference between people who are in communities of practice and people who are not. And there was a 27% retention advantage if you were in a community of practice. So I think we can take advantage of those surveys and piece out the data of where people are sharing, where people are in community and so forth, and prove some things about KM through that mechanism.
Yeah, that's interesting. Chris, I know one of your clients that I think personally is really cool. I'm a huge Olympic fan, is the International Olympic Committee. And you probably go through this with them. And I bet you don't mind me mentioning this, but what are the discussions related to this topic that you've had with them? And I think it's a pretty long-term client for you, Chris.
Well, it is. I guess their unit of measurement is risk reduction. I guess that's the whole focus of all of their KM activities. How can we ensure that the Olympic Games happen on time? On budget is almost kind of secondary, but the show has to go on at the right time, despite extraneous factors like COVID. So all of the focus of their knowledge sharing is how can we reduce the risk that something goes wrong, which is obviously about bringing to bear stuff that's gone before. And they do invest heavily in building the relational capital, which I guess is a bit like putting in the wiring into your house, and knowing which way the wiring goes, and you and I, Dan, have both used ONA to look at that, isn't quite the same as knowing that the current is flowing. That's when the lights come on, right? So we can visualize the potential for relationships, and we can put in place, as the IOC do, the kind of the social places where people can meet and build relationships. But even that won't guarantee that knowledge will flow, but you're kind of putting the channels in there in advance in the hope that, having built trust and relationships, then when the need is expressed, when there's a desire, when there's a potential difference between someone who wants something and someone who's got something, then the channel's in place for knowledge to flow from one to the other.
Yeah, that's good. And Nancy, you talked about how, you've done a lot of work over the last few years with international organizations, nonprofit. I mentioned that I've been working for the International Organization for Migration. I call them an 85% human capital organization. So it's all about relationships there, et cetera. And quite frankly, I've introduced a few things with them, to the ideas to be able to measure knowledge sharing and put a value on it, but it's not easy. There's so much intangibility associated with things that I've shared with them that it's hard to kind of grasp onto, maybe to be able to demonstrate, because you get to a point in a program where there's so much more you can do, and maybe some other people here are in this position. There's so much more you can do if you could just demonstrate some tangible measurement to be able to justify and go to your leader or your leader's leader, your supervisor, and say, hey, I need these other two resources because I think we can continue to build on our overall KM ecosystem, if you will. So how do you overcome that type of challenge in an organization that's just so, like Chris just talked about, so human capital oriented? Nancy?
Oh, sorry, I didn't realize you were calling on me. One of the things that USAID has done was a program I worked with for the around the male circumcision program. I hate to mention that with all these men on.
It sounds painful. Go ahead.
Yes, but anyway, it is a way to prevent AIDS, and so in that program, we did a huge handover, which was really wonderful, because one region, in fact, had done an amazing job with that. And so we then brought teams from other regions together, and it was not a sort of presenting thing. It was a team member from the region that had done so well set with every other single team over a 2-day period, and the learning and so forth was just astounding. And that's measurable. It's measurable with whether, how many males were circumcised after that meeting is in fact countable. So I think you can do some things like that show it worked.
Yeah, absolutely. Presenters? Yeah, Tom.
So this conversation about relationships and human capital reminds me of our great leader, Larry Prusak, back in our IBM days. And he used to talk about, he introduced us, at least me, I don't know if others on our team knew about it then, but he introduced me to the concept of social capital and how important it was in terms of knowledge management work. And he used to define it as trust, rapport, and anticipated reciprocity. And that was his pithy definition of social capital. And he said, this is knowledge transfer is difficult because tacit knowledge is sticky, and social capital is a way of reducing the friction for transferring knowledge, because we have a shared language, we have mutual trust and respect for each other. We will take the lesson learned and run with it as given, rather than question it or wonder, does this person really know what they're doing? And so that's a small example of social capital. So I think that, getting back to Jasper's question, is it worth it to bring all these scientists together? If you think about social capital and the fact that bringing them together is a way of building it that is very difficult to replicate, even in virtual space, then it comes down to, well, how do you measure that? And I forget who it was talking about the tags that mapped the social connections that happened during a business meeting. I mean, there it is, right? I mean, because if you baseline the relationships going into that meeting and then map the new relationships that were created during it, you have a great mechanism to claim victory with empirical evidence that, yes, look at all the good that came out of this. Here was our network before, here's our network after, and look what's happened in whatever domain they happen to be focused on. So I think that there's a lot there. And these are subtle techniques that are not often invoked. And there are a lot of newer practitioners who aren't aware of all the work that was done in social network analysis. And I think these are powerful tools that we shouldn't forget about. I mean, people are still people, and whether we're in virtual space or in person space, I think these dynamics are very similar.
Yeah. I want to, Ryan, before I get to you, I want to bring Stan into the conversation briefly here. One of the things that we all see with the SIKM forum that Stan is brilliant at is when a question comes up, and there have been this question's been asked before, and maybe there's been some excellent discussion happening, is that Stan will say, hey, you may want to take a look at these 2 or 3 or 4 or even more in some cases, discussions that previously took place. And you've seen this over so many years, Stan, this kind of discussion. And I don't know if you would agree that it just continues to be this conundrum that I referred to, this difficult thing to answer, et cetera. But I just wanted to get your thoughts on this topic.
Yeah, thanks very much, Dan. It's definitely a feeling of deja vu, where we've had 16 years of the community, and this discussion comes about every so often, and we've gone through and tagged them so you can go back and refer to them and learn from them. But in many cases, the discussion tends to be somewhat familiar. It's new to people that are new to it, and it's familiar to those of us who have been around for a while. I'm not sure that there's too much new, that comes about. It's kind of my feeling about the field in general. That we don't have too much new, but it's new to a lot of people who are joining KM for the first time. So I would go back to the stories about, telling stories as well as trying to measure a combination. I think Tim said that it was good to do both, and I'd agree with that. What we found is when we're doing attempt to measure the value of what we're doing at HP, if we ask people to try to submit information about how much time they saved or dollars made, people just wouldn't do that. You just couldn't get them to spend time filling in, even if it was just a brief form. But we did instead is we created a community, essentially an online forum that said, reuse stories. If you have a successful example of reuse, just kind of post in here and tell us a little bit about it, more in narrative form rather than in analytical form. And that seemed to work better. People would be happy to say, this thing helped in this way. I think retelling those stories ended up being much more useful than trying to document. We thought at first we could document down to the dollar what we saved or what money we made. It's just people wouldn't provide that.
Yeah, interesting. Ryan, I'll jump up to you and then go to Jonathan.
Thanks. I just wanted to add one more point about measuring those meetings events, the ROI in those meetings. Another thing that was implemented, which I was directly involved with, was creating a meeting app. And that app allowed mail transfer to participants. So although we have our enterprise network connect systems, we have our people systems and all that sort of thing, it was more important that this app was their tool to the conference. It was a tool to the meeting, and it had let them do instant messaging. It let them do mail back and forth. It gave them a map of the conference area. It gave them activities and calendar schedule, and everything was in the app. And one of the ways to measure ROI and to map those connections, not only from the data tags or the RFID tags people were wearing, but was to look at the data from the app and say, this conference had X number of messages sent back and forth. And there was prizes for people that were using the app, leaderboards and stuff like that, encouraging use. It's a way to look at, as one person mentioned, you do your baseline beforehand, and then you have something like this, and then you can look at it afterwards. If you look at the data from that app, you can say, look at all the connections that were made, and you don't have to ask people about those connections. Leveraging the technology to report on those connections. No, you're not going to capture the informal sitting at a bar type connection, which is, agreeably the most beneficial. But this also is another way to at least get an indicator of those connections to some sort of level.
Excellent. And Jonathan, pass the baton over to you. Jonathan Norman, thanks for being with us.
Thank you. I just wanted to ask whether you thought that things were changing in terms of perceived value of different approaches to knowledge sharing. My good friend Eddie Obeng talks about the world after midnight, this time somewhere between 2000 and 2010, where the speed of change overtook the speed at which organizations can learn, which has kind of placed a much greater emphasis on social learning, on learning in the now, rather than stuff that we thought we knew from yesterday.
That's pretty interesting. There's somebody on the call today I want to bring into the conversation, and that's Tom Barfield. Tom, I'm going to put you on the spot here. As a longtime leader in knowledge management, I know you came up with a lot of very creative ways to measure. And just to build on the thoughts that you've heard today, Tom, and with the professional services firm and leading their knowledge management organization there, and now in your capacity as an executive leader for a search-related company, what comments can you bring to bear on this conversation? Continue to build on what we've talked about today. Thanks for being with us, Tom.
Thanks for putting me on the spot.
You're welcome.
Couple thoughts. I remember, about 15 years ago, we did an ROI study. So we just at Accenture. I grew up in Accenture and led knowledge management there for many years. But I grew up out of the learning organization, and we just did in 2006. We did a ROI study on learning. And so since we'd done an ROI study on learning, it was an opportunity to do an ROI study in knowledge management. And there are a lot of different factors that we could have measured, that we wanted to measure: quality, all sorts of things. We ended up focusing on the easiest one, which was time. And we came up with an approach that demonstrated, there was a tremendous, the time saved from having to search, or the time saved from not having to reinvent the wheel. And now I'll tell you, we did that, demonstrated a huge ROI. There's a lot of a lot of people were impressed. Now, when I shared that, it just so happened that at the same time I was going to meet with, I was reporting to a new part of the organization, and sat down with the leader who actually came from the client-facing part of Accenture, right? So, with Accenture, you got internal folks, and you got folks that were, kind of focused on, actually profit for the company. And I showed this, the study to him, and he was he was really impressed. He's like, wow, and he was immediately on the back of a napkin translating this into, kind of dollars and cents and millions of dollars. And then he turned to me and said, Tom, this is all fantastic, but let's have an agreement here that while you're working for me, you will never do this again. He's like, leadership here, we're already, we already buy in, right? We buy into this, right? Mm-hmm. I don't need you spending your time on, so much energy on proving the value. I need you focusing your efforts on increasing the value. And so somewhere in there is we got to be very careful in taking a temperature of our leadership and who we're working with to really understand how far do we need to go with this. Are they already convinced of the effort and the value? Because doing this. Doing anything in the measurement space, it can be extremely time consuming, and it can take away from our ability to have more value because we're trying to measure the value. So I'll throw that out.
Yeah, interesting. Sharon Wilson in the chat just said that, it's in the professional services area, it's table stakes. And Tom agreed with that. It's kind of like the centrifugal force that was talked about in Good to Great back in 2001, that big, huge thing we're trying to push around is already happening. It's already happening. So it's like, yeah, we buy into that. And I guess that's a good thing. Did you feel like at the time that was good that did you feel like, okay, this is nice to know?
But you got to be careful with that because leadership changes, right? Mm-hmm. And
right.
The next leader can come in and really want that. So you kind of have to find that balance of where you're
right,
how much you're investing in.
Right, it's an ongoing change situation at the top of organizations. Let me lean into our presenters, our fish inside the bowl today. Comments as we're getting closer to closing out this very interesting discussion today. Yeah, go ahead, Nancy.
Yeah, I want to come back to this idea that we're in remote now, that we've learned the value of remote and so forth. And I wrote a blog post for the Drucker Forum recently that had kind of an impact. And what I wrote about in there was to say that we ought to be giving people choice about remote. We found out that remote is productive and so forth. But what we need to do as well is periodically bring a team back together, and not to sit in their cubicles and type on the computers, but to think and plan together. Maybe it's once a quarter, maybe it's once every 2 months, whatever. But people need to come back together just for the social reasons we've been talking about, to learn from each other, to share ideas and so forth. So rather than saying choose any 2 days of the week that you want to come into the office, I think organizations need to be saying, make your own choices about all of that. But every third week, we are back in the office together for 3 days or for 4 days or whatever it is, because we need that social connection.
Absolutely. So insightful. And Andrew, passing over to you.
Thank you. And I kind of go back to some of the stuff, even with Stan was talking, and then Tom, about different things that have happened over the, might say, decade or decades. So when we began some of our journey doing this, we started off mainly with participation metrics, you might say, and then various stories. We then progressed to do an ROI, fairly detailed ROI analysis, business impacts, kind of based on human capital, since we are in our learning organization. That's where this is housed. Plus, we use a lot of the techniques from the ROI Institute, some pretty good stuff, and we keep those updated. However, now we're seeing it kind of shifting back again to participation metrics again. And really, you might say, increase in participation and stories again. So it's going to be, we're seeing it kind of cyclical over time, depending on, again, who the leadership is, who the senior leaders are, and what they might be interested in.
Very, very good. Yeah, Robert, you were going to say something.
Could I just say quickly to Tom, I loved your story, Tom. Could I just say to his point about measurement being expensive? I mean, this is a point, isn't it? One of the little stories I use, and I wish I'd kept it. I wish I'd kept the picture. It was an advertising hoarding. It was Ben and Jerry's. And if anyone's got it, you got to let me have it, because I don't have it. But I remember the story. It was Ben and Jerry's and the pecans, you know, and they're making their ice cream is the story. And one day they think, oh, we better go to the store and buy some scales just to make sure we sort of measure out the pecans properly in each portion. And they say we get to the store and we look at it, we look at the scales, we look at the pecans, and we just bought more pecans. I think, yeah, that's it, you know.
Yeah, people love pecans. So Andrew, you were going to comment back on that.
Oh, sorry, I should have taken that off.
Sorry about that.
Although I should say, from coming from a Texas pronunciation there, I wasn't sure what he was saying at first there. I always pronounced it as pecans. So it took me a while to figure out where you were going there, Rob, with that. So thank you. I will take my hand off now, though.
Okay. Appreciate you doing that.
We had an old expression back when we were doing process redesign work and measuring current cost of processes and accuracy and so forth. And our expression was measure with a micrometer, mark with chalk, cut with an axe. So, you know, we'd go and collect all this detailed data and, you know, get it down to 6 decimals and then go, 20%.
Yeah, yeah.
And, you know, because you couldn't do 0.3 of a person, or, you know, the numbers didn't break that way. So measure with a micrometer, mark it with chalk, cut it with an axe.
Yeah, so like John Cougar Mellencamp once said, it's close enough for rock and roll.
There you go.
Exactly. So dip back into the 80s with some tunes, always. So any other comments to kind of bring this all together? You know, Nancy said something at the beginning before everybody was on that, you know, Dan, we should do an after action review. And I totally agree with that on this session. Stan, I think you were on when she was talking about that, to see whether or not, you know, this kind of approach. I mean, for me, I got to tell you, it's just a real honor. I see so many people with so much experience to be able to facilitate a session like this. It's just fabulous to be able to hear, you know, these tacit knowledge exchanges happening and building on this important topic that we all struggle with. As long as we've been in the game, we still all struggle with it. And to be able to learn and to at least, and sometimes maybe even commiserate, it makes you feel like, yeah, you know, I understand why I'm in a tough area and I'm trying to do something that is really super hard to do. Stan, you have a comment. I see your face.
Yeah, I think that having these kind of sessions and having them more of them, you don't need to limit them anyway. It's really up to the willingness of anyone to do a session like Dan was today, and for the people in the Fishbowl to agree to Dan's request to join them. So I would say after action review for this, other methods to try out and demonstrate. You know, I've always felt that the community should be more than just me trying to have a monthly call. It should be everyone in the community being willing to lead whatever they want to lead, whenever they want to lead it is great.
Yeah, absolutely. And we appreciate your leadership for sure. And I just want to open it up for any final comments as we close out in a timely fashion today.
I'll share a pro tip for anybody who's working on knowledge management in their company and getting pushback on a proposed effort based on budget concerns. This is the pro tip. Ask the person questioning you how much it costs to send your kid to college. Universities are nothing but knowledge transfer exercises. And so if somebody's balking at the idea of spending X amount of money on your work because you're trying to foster knowledge transfer, knowledge sharing, keep in mind how much we spend to put kids through education, including our own selves in some cases. We spend a lot of money. Why is that? I mean, it's a giant knowledge transfer exercise. And so sometimes you can't quantify the value in dollars and cents, but yet you know in your bones, there's value there and we should go after it. And as long as you're keeping that in mind, I think you're going to make the right choice and the right call.
Yeah, that's a great point. That's a great point. And I've had an opportunity lately to talk with a lot of companies that from I call them hero organizations, you know, where they have a few people doing a lot of the work, and they want to make this leap to become a learning organization. And how do we go there? How do we get there? Can you write it down? Can you take the ambiguity out for us? Can you make it black and white and the steps we have to take? Well, until you do the kind of things and recognize the kind of things that Tom was just talking about, and many of us has commented on today, I mean, how can you even think about getting to where you're really truly a learning organization, however it is you want to define that? Chris, a comment to close us out today.
Wow, you have to put the pressure on me there. I guess it's been really nice to see this process, for the big Americans out of it. We've kind of lived the thing, haven't we? We've had a conversation, sharing knowledge with each other from our experience. At the same time, there's been, in many ways, a more exciting conversation going on in the chat with a wider group of people sharing insights. And I've made so many ahas and copied so many links down from the outer circle conversation. And it just goes to show that knowledge sharing breeds knowledge sharing, doesn't it?
Yeah, indeed. Well, let's close it out with that. And I'm going to follow through on my promise to share with everybody through SIKM a recording of today's session, as well as capture the chats that took place. And I just want to thank Stan, his leadership again, and I want to thank our presenters today. It's been fabulous, and we want to thank all the observers, everybody that has participated in the session today. It's been really, really nice, and we appreciate it, and we hope to do it again for sure, as appropriate. Okay, thanks everybody. Have a great day, afternoon, or evening.
Nice job, Dan.
Thank you.
Thanks, Dan.
Appreciate it.